The dust-laden wind carried the sound of the gavel, each strike hammering Grace Porter's fate deeper into the wooden platform beneath her feet. Montana Territory, 1876, a place where fortunes were made and souls were lost in equal measure. At 20 years old, Grace never imagined she'd be standing on an auction block in the ramshackle town of Wasco, being sold to the highest bidder by the only family she had left in this world. $500 for the girl. Do I hear $6? The auctioneer called, his voice carrying across the crowded street where curious onlookers and potential buyers had gathered in the late afternoon sun. Grace kept her eyes fixed on the distant mountains, refusing to acknowledge the hungry stares assessing her worth. Her Uncle Frank had brought her west after her parents died of fever back in Ohio, promising a new start. Instead, he'd gambled away their meager savings and decided his niece was the final asset to liquidate before moving on to California gold country. She's healthy and educated. Can cook, clean, and sew better than most. $600. Do I hear $7? The auctioneer's voice cracked with excitement as the bidding continued. A cold dread washed over Grace as she spotted the saloon owner, Theo Maxwell, nodding to raise the bid. His reputation for employing young women was well known throughout the territory. Her fingers curled into fists, nails digging into her palms. She would run tonight if necessary before submitting to such a fate. 700, Maxwell called out confidently, a smug smile crossing his face. 750, countered a voice from the back. 800, Maxwell shot back quickly. $1,000. The crowd fell silent at the new bid, heads turning toward a tall figure leaning against a hitching post at the edge of the gathering. The man straightened, pushing his hat back to reveal sun-bronzed features framed by dark hair. His expression remained impassive as he stepped forward, but his eyes sharp and clear as a winter sky locked briefly with Grace's. 1,000 going once. The auctioneer stammered, clearly surprised by the sudden jump in price. Maxwell swore under his breath but shook his head, unwilling to match the bid. Going twice. Sold. To Mr. Xavier Weston for $1,000. Grace's uncle scurried forward to collect the money, his eyes gleaming with greed rather than remorse. The stranger Weston counted out the bills methodically before turning his attention to Grace, who still stood frozen on the platform. "Come on down from there, miss," he said, his voice low and steady. "You don't belong on an auction block." As Grace descended the rickety steps, her uncle intercepted her, gripping her arm. "Remember your place, girl. You've been paid for fair and square." Before she could respond, Weston stepped between them, his tall frame eclipsing her uncle's stooped figure. "The lady will be coming with me now," he stated firmly. Then, with a glance at Grace that held something she couldn't quite identify, he added, "I'll be the family you deserve." Grace followed him in stunned silence, away from the dispersing crowd, away from the last of her blood kin who had valued her only for what she could bring at auction. "Where are we going?" she finally managed to ask as they approached a wagon hitched to 2 sturdy horses. "My ranch about 10 miles outside of town," he replied, helping her onto the seat. "Unless you have somewhere else you'd rather go." "No." The word came out barely above a whisper as the reality of her situation settled in. "I have nowhere." Weston climbed up beside her and took the reins. "Then we'd best get moving before sundown. Storm's coming." Grace studied him from the corner of her eye as they pulled away from Wasco. His profile was stern but not unkind, with a strong jaw shadowed by a day's growth of beard. His clothes were plain but well kept, the garb of a working rancher rather than a town dandy. "Why did you buy me, Mr. Weston?" she asked directly, finding her voice at last. He glanced at her, then back at the road. "I didn't buy you, Miss Porter. I stopped a travesty. No person should be sold like cattle. After a pause, he added, and I need help at my ranch. The previous housekeeper left 2 months ago to marry a storekeeper in Helena. So I'm to be your housekeeper. Relief flooded through her at the mundane explanation. If you wish to stay, yes. But you're not obligated. I'll pay you a fair wage, and when you've saved enough to start over somewhere else, you're free to go. He adjusted his hat against the setting sun. I meant what I said back there. I know what it's like to lose family and be left with people who see you as nothing but a burden or a means to an end. The wagon hit a rut in the road, jostling them closer momentarily. Grace shifted away, maintaining a proper distance. Thank you, she said simply. For the rescue and the offer of work. I accept both. Weston nodded once, seeming satisfied with her answer. They continued in silence as the town of Wasco faded behind them, the twilight deepening around the rolling grasslands that stretched toward distant mountains. True to his prediction, fat raindrops began to fall as they turned onto a narrow track leading to a sprawling property. Grace could make out a substantial log house with a wide porch, several outbuildings and corrals containing horses that lifted their heads at the wagon's approach. "Welcome to Horizon Ranch," Weston said as they pulled up to the house. A young man emerged from the barn, hurrying over to take the horses once they stopped. "Garrett, this is Miss Porter. She'll be taking over household duties," Weston explained, helping Grace down from the wagon. "Madam," Garrett nodded respectfully, though his curious gaze lingered a moment too long. "Miss Porter arrived in town today under difficult circumstances," Weston added pointedly. "I expect everyone to show her proper respect." "Yes, sir," Garrett replied, leading the team away. Inside, the house was larger than it appeared from outside, solidly built and surprisingly comfortable. A large main room contained a stone fireplace, sturdy furniture, and bookcases filled with volumes that instantly caught Grace's attention. Beyond lay a kitchen, and she glimpsed a hallway leading to what she presumed were bedrooms. "You'll have your own room," Weston explained, showing her to a modest but clean chamber at the back of the house. "It's small but private. There's a washroom across the hall." Grace stepped inside, taking in the neatly made bed, chest of drawers, and small window overlooking the eastern pastures. It was more than she'd expected. "I have nothing," she realized aloud, the full weight of her situation crashing down. "No clothes except what I'm wearing. There's a trunk in the attic with some things left behind by my sister before she moved east. You're welcome to them until we can get to town for proper supplies." He paused at the doorway. "Are you hungry?" she nodded, suddenly aware of the hollow feeling in her stomach. "I'll heat up some stew." "Take your time settling in." When Grace entered the kitchen 20 minutes later, having washed her face and hands and tidied her hair as best she could, Weston was placing 2 bowls on the table. The rich aroma of beef stew made her mouth water. "It's nothing fancy," he apologized. "I'm a passable cook, but only with simple fare. It smells wonderful." She sat where he indicated, folding her hands in her lap while he poured coffee. As they ate, Grace ventured to learn more about her new employer. "How long have you had this ranch, Mr. Weston?" "5 years. Built it up from almost nothing." Pride colored his voice. "And please call me Xavier. Mr. Weston makes me feel like my father." "Xavier, then." The name felt strange on her tongue. "And I'm Grace." "Grace," he repeated. "Fitting name." She felt a flush creeping up her neck at the implied compliment. "And your ranch hands? Is it just Garrett?" "No, there's 5 of them total. Garrett, Tom, and Miguel stay in the bunkhouse year-round. Liam and Jeb are seasonal, helping with the herd during summer months." He broke off a piece of bread. "They're good men, they won't bother you, and your family, you mentioned a sister." Something shifted in his expression. "Rebecca," She married a banker and moved to Boston 3 years ago. He sipped his coffee. My parents died when I was 17. Fever took my mother and my father was killed in a mining accident 6 months later. I'm sorry. Grace recognized the familiar shadow of loss in his eyes. My parents died of fever too, last winter, and your uncle became your guardian. She nodded, pushing her spoon through the remaining stew. He wasn't always so, callous. The journey west changed him, or perhaps revealed who he truly was. Xavier studied her for a moment. Some men discover their true character in hardship, others lose it. He stood, taking their empty bowls to the sink. You should rest. Tomorrow will come early. That night, lying in an unfamiliar bed, Grace stared at the ceiling and listened to the rain drumming on the roof. Her mind replayed the day's events standing on that platform, exposed to strangers' evaluating gazes, the moment Xavier had stepped forward, the relief when they'd left town behind. She'd escaped one fate only to face uncertain prospects with a man she didn't know. But something about Xavier Weston inspired trust. Perhaps it was the respect with which he'd treated her since the moment he'd bid on her freedom, or the comfortable distance he maintained, or maybe just the quiet dignity he carried himself with. Whatever it was, Grace found herself drifting to sleep with less fear than she would have expected on such a tumultuous day. Morning came with birdsong and golden light streaming through the small window. For a moment, Grace was disoriented, then the previous day's events came rushing back. She rose quickly, washing and dressing in one of the simple dresses she'd found in the trunk Xavier had mentioned. It was slightly large but serviceable with a few strategic pins. She found Xavier in the kitchen, just returning from the barn. He paused when he saw her, a flicker of something approval perhaps crossing his features before he nodded a greeting. There's coffee on the stove, he said, and eggs in the pantry. The men have already eaten. I'll prepare breakfast right away, Grace replied, moving toward the stove. No rush. They're all out working already. He poured himself coffee. I thought I'd show you around the property after breakfast so you know your way around. The tour revealed a well-organized ranch spanning several hundred acres. Xavier explained the operation. They raised cattle primarily, but also kept horses, some of which he bred and trained himself. That's my real passion, he admitted as they watched a magnificent black stallion trot around a corral. Cattle pay the bills, but horses. He trailed off, but the look in his eyes completed the thought. By the end of the first week, Grace had settled into a routine. She rose early to prepare breakfast for the ranch hands, maintained the house, washed laundry, and prepared the evening meal. The work was hard but satisfying, and Xavier proved to be a fair employer, neither demanding nor intrusive. She learned more about him through observation than conversation. He was a man of few words but deliberate actions. He treated his workers with respect, worked alongside them frequently, and expected the same dedication he demonstrated. In the evenings, she often found him reading by the fire history, mostly, but occasionally poetry, which surprised her. One evening, as she brought him coffee after dinner, he looked up from his book with an expression that suggested he'd been waiting to speak. I need to ride into Wasco tomorrow for supplies, he said. I thought you might want to come along, get some things for yourself. Grace hesitated. I haven't earned much wage yet. Consider it an advance. He closed his book. A woman needs her own things. The next morning they set out early in the wagon. Grace felt a strange mix of apprehension and anticipation as they approached the town. It had been her first glimpse of the West, associated with humiliation and abandonment, yet she needed to face it again. Wasco was busier than on the day of her arrival, with freight wagons loading at the general store and cowboys milling around the saloon despite the early hour. "I have business at the bank and the lumber yard," Xavier explained as he helped her down. "Would you prefer to do your shopping alone, or shall we meet at the general store in an hour? I can manage on my own," Grace assured him, grateful for his sensitivity to her independence. Mrs. Abernathy, the storekeeper's wife, was helpful if overly curious, asking pointed questions about Grace's arrangement at the Weston place while assisting with fabric selections. "Such a private man, Mr. Weston," she commented, measuring out yards of calico. "Been here 5 years, and barely know more about him than the day he arrived. Bought that land when nobody thought it worth having, and now look at him." Grace merely smiled politely, unwilling to feed the woman's obvious hunger for gossip. She selected several practical items: fabric for dresses, undergarments, a sturdy pair of boots, and personal necessities. As she waited for her purchases to be wrapped, the bell above the door jingled. Grace turned to see Maxwell, the saloon owner who had bid on her, entering the store. His eyes widened in recognition, then narrowed as he approached. "Well, if it isn't Weston's new acquisition," he drawled, looking her up and down. "How's life as a rancher's woman treating you, darling?" Grace straightened her spine. "I am Mr. Weston's housekeeper, sir, nothing more." "Please excuse me." She tried to step around him, but he shifted to block her path. "Housekeeper, is it? That what they're calling it these days?" His breath smelled of tobacco and whiskey even in the morning hours. "When you tire of playing house with that cold fish, my offer stands. Good money for a pretty girl at my establishment." The lady said, "Excuse her." Xavier's voice, low and hard as iron, came from behind Maxwell. The saloon owner turned, his smirk faltering slightly at whatever he saw in Xavier's expression. "Just having a friendly conversation, Weston," Maxwell said, raising his hands in mock surrender. "No harm in that. There's harm in harassing a lady who's made her disinterest clear." Xavier moved forward, creating space for Grace to step away. "I suggest you find someone else to converse with." Maxwell's face darkened, but he evidently thought better of pursuing the confrontation. With a final contemptuous glance at them both, he exited the store. "Are you all right?" Xavier asked once the door closed behind Maxwell. "Yes," Grace assured him, though her hands trembled slightly. "Thank you for intervening." Men like Maxwell understand only one thing: that some prey bites back. He nodded toward her packages. "Are you finished here?" As they loaded their supplies into the wagon, Grace noticed Xavier was quieter than usual, his jaw tight with what seemed like suppressed anger. "He's not worth your concern," she ventured as they left town behind. Xavier glanced at her. "It's not him I'm angry with. It's this place these times, where a man can think he has the right to speak to a woman that way, to buy her and face no consequences." "You bought me," Grace pointed out softly. His hands tightened on the reins. "I freed you. There's a difference." After a pause, he added, "I hope you know that." "I do," she assured him, surprising herself with how true it felt. In the weeks she'd been at Horizon Ranch, not once had Xavier treated her as property or made her feel indebted beyond the fair exchange of work for wages. They rode in companionable silence for several miles before Xavier spoke again. "I should have asked sooner. Are you content at the ranch? Is there anything you need that you don't have?" Grace considered the question seriously. "I have everything I need. As for contentment..." She watched a hawk circling overhead. "I'm still finding my footing in this new life, but I'm grateful for the chance to do so on my own terms." Xavier nodded, seeming to understand what she wasn't quite saying: that she was healing slowly from the wounds of betrayal and abandonment. That evening, after the ranch hands had retired to the bunkhouse, Grace sat on the porch with a cup of tea, watching stars appear in the vast Montana sky. Xavier joined her, settling into a chair with a respectful distance between them. "I used to do this with my father," Grace said after a comfortable silence. "He taught me the constellations, said they were God's map for lost travelers. Were you close to your parents?" "Very. My father was a teacher, my mother a midwife. They believed in education for everyone, including girls." She sipped her tea. "They would have hated knowing I ended up as my uncle's chattel." "What would you have become if they'd lived?" Xavier asked quietly. The question caught her off guard. No one had asked about her dreams in so long. "I wanted to be a teacher like my father, or perhaps a writer." She laughed self-consciously. "Impractical ambitions for a woman out here, I suppose." "Why impractical? Montana needs teachers, and writers come from everywhere." He gestured toward the endless landscape. "There are worse places to find stories." His words stayed with Grace long after they'd bid each other good night. It had been so long since someone had encouraged her aspirations rather than diminished them. The following weeks brought a steady rhythm to life at Horizon Ranch. Grace found satisfaction in making the house truly livable, adding curtains she'd sewn from the fabric purchased in town, arranging wildflowers in mason jars, and preparing increasingly ambitious meals as she grew more comfortable with the kitchen. Xavier noticed her efforts, occasionally commenting on an improvement or expressing appreciation for a particularly good meal. His approval, though quietly expressed, meant more than she cared to admit. As spring strengthened its hold on the land, the pace of ranch work intensified. Xavier spent long days in the saddle, often returning after dark, tired but satisfied with the progress being made with the herd and the new foals. One evening in late May, as Grace was preparing to serve dinner, Xavier didn't return at the usual time. When darkness fell with no sign of him, she began to worry. Just as she was considering sending one of the hands to search, hoofbeats approached the house. She hurried onto the porch to see Xavier dismounting slowly, one arm held awkwardly against his body. "What happened?" she asked, rushing down the steps. Young Stallion took exception to being gentled, he explained, grimacing as he removed his hat. "Threw me into a fence post." In the kitchen light, Grace could see a nasty gash along his temple and the way he favored his left side. "Sit down," she ordered, already moving to heat water. "You need that cleaned properly." To her surprise, he complied without argument, easing himself into a chair at the table. She gathered clean cloths, her mother's small medical kit that she'd managed to keep through all the upheavals, and a bottle of whiskey from the cupboard. "This will sting," she warned as she began cleaning the head wound. Xavier remained stoically still, though she knew it must hurt considerably. "Where did you learn this?" he asked as she worked. "My mother. She taught me basic healing skills." Grace concentrated on removing dirt from the cut. "I believe you'll need stitches for this one." He nodded once. "Do what you need to." Grace sterilized a needle in the flame of an oil lamp, then threaded it with silk thread from her mother's kit. With steady hands that belied her nervousness, she placed 5 neat stitches along the gash. "Now your ribs," she said when she'd finished. "I need to check if they're broken." Xavier hesitated, then carefully removed his shirt. Grace tried to maintain a professional demeanor, but she couldn't help noticing the lean, muscled contours of his torso, marked here and there with old scars that spoke of a life lived physically. A large bruise was already forming along his left side. Grace gently probed the area, aware of his sharp intake of breath when she touched a particularly tender spot. "I don't think they're broken," she concluded. "Badly bruised, certainly, possibly cracked. You'll need to rest for a few days." "Can't afford to," he said grimly. "Cattle drive preparations start tomorrow. The men can manage without you for a day or two. Grace, Xavier." She met his gaze directly. My mother always said the most stubborn patients were the ones who ended up bedridden longest. Please just rest tomorrow, doctor's orders. A fleeting smile crossed his face. Are you a doctor now? The closest thing you'll find within 20 miles, so yes, for tonight I am. She began wrapping his ribs with clean bandages, and I'm prescribing rest. As her fingers worked, Grace became increasingly aware of their proximity, of the warmth of his skin beneath her hands, of his steady gaze on her face as she concentrated on her task. When she finished, she stepped back quickly, turning to put away her supplies. "Thank you," Xavier said quietly. "You have a healer's touch like your mother." The simple compliment warmed her more than it should have. "You should eat something, then sleep," she advised, recovering her composure. "I'll bring you a plate." True to his word, Xavier stayed at the house the next day, though he insisted on working at his desk rather than resting in bed. Grace found herself inventing reasons to check on him, bringing coffee, asking about household accounts, seeking his opinion on meal plans. By evening, the forced inactivity had made him restless. He joined her on the porch after dinner, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in gold and crimson. "Beautiful country," Grace observed, settling into her usual chair. "It is," Xavier agreed. After a pause, he added, "When I first saw this land, I knew it was where I belonged. Something about the openness of it, the challenge of it." "I'm beginning to understand that feeling," she admitted. "There's a freedom here that I never knew back east." He turned to look at her, his expression thoughtful. "Are you happy here, Grace?" Truly, the question caught her off guard. Yes, I believe I am. More than I expected to be after everything that happened." "Good, I want you to be." He seemed about to say more, then stopped himself. "It's getting cooler. We should go inside." In the following days, as Xavier's injuries healed and he returned to full duties, Grace found herself watching him with new awareness. The way he moved, the sound of his voice, the rare moments when he truly smiled all registered with a clarity that both confused and thrilled her. It was foolish, she told herself firmly. He was her employer, her rescuer, perhaps even becoming her friend, but nothing more. He had never shown any indication of romantic interest, maintaining a careful propriety in all their interactions. Yet sometimes she caught him looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher, and in those moments she wondered. June brought the cattle drive, taking Xavier and most of the hands away for 2 weeks. Grace found herself missing not just his presence but the specific details of him, the sound of his boots on the porch steps, the way he absently ran a hand through his hair when thinking, the quiet thank you that accompanied every meal she served. When they returned, successful and in good spirits, Grace had prepared a celebratory dinner. The men ate heartily, sharing tales of the drive that grew more exaggerated with each telling. Later, after the hands had retired to the bunkhouse, Xavier lingered at the table while Grace cleared the dishes. "I brought something for you," he said, reaching into his vest pocket. He placed a small package wrapped in paper on the table. "It's not much, but I saw it and thought of you." Grace wiped her hands on her apron and sat down, carefully unwrapping the gift. Inside was a small journal bound in soft brown leather with a pencil secured in a loop along the spine. "For your writing," Xavier explained, "or teaching notes or whatever you wish." Grace ran her fingers over the smooth cover, touched beyond words by the thoughtfulness of the gift. He had remembered her dreams, taken them seriously enough to encourage them in this tangible way. "Thank you," she said softly. "This means a great deal to me. You're welcome." He stood, seeming almost embarrassed by her emotion. "Good night, Grace." "Good night, Xavier." That night, Grace wrote her first entry in the journal, not about her past or her daily activities, but about the feeling of belonging that had slowly taken root in her heart, here in this place, with these people. With him. July brought scorching heat that turned the grasslands golden and kept everyone close to water sources when possible. Grace rose early to complete her heaviest work before the worst heat of the day, often bringing cold tea to the men working with the horses in the corral. One particularly hot afternoon, she walked down to the creek that ran along the eastern edge of the property, seeking relief in the shade of the cottonwoods that lined its banks. She was surprised to find Xavier already there, sitting on a large flat rock with his bare feet in the water, reading a book. He looked up at her approach, closing his book. "Great minds think alike," he observed with a small smile. "The house becomes an oven on days like this." "I didn't mean to intrude," Grace said, hesitating. "You're not intruding at all." He patted the rock beside him. "Plenty of room and the water feels wonderful." After a moment's consideration, Grace sat down, removed her boots and stockings, and dipped her feet into the cool creek. The relief was immediate and delicious. "What are you reading?" she asked, nodding toward the book in his lap. He held it up. Whitman's Leaves of Grass. "Not everyone's taste, but I find his celebration of America compelling." "I've read some of his work," Grace admitted. "My father had a small collection of poetry. Whitman speaks to something primal, doesn't he? Something honest about human experience." Xavier looked at her with new interest. "Yes, exactly. Most people just find him scandalous." "Perhaps because honesty often is scandalous," she suggested. He laughed, a full, rich sound that Grace realized she'd rarely heard. "A philosopher as well as a healer. You continually surprise me, Grace Porter." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the play of sunlight on water. A family of ducks paddled upstream, the ducklings trailing in their mother's wake. "I've been meaning to ask you something," Xavier said eventually. "The town's organizing an Independence Day celebration next week. There'll be a picnic, dancing, fireworks. Would you like to attend?" Grace felt a flutter of excitement at the prospect. "I would, yes." "Good." He seemed relieved at her answer. "I rarely go to these things, but I thought, well, you might enjoy the change of scenery." The day of the celebration dawned clear and hot. Grace took special care with her appearance, wearing a new dress she'd made from the blue calico purchased in town, and arranging her honey-brown hair in a style more elaborate than her usual practical bun. When she emerged from her room, she found Xavier waiting in the main room, dressed in his best clothes: dark pants, a crisp white shirt, and a vest that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders. He looked up as she entered, and for a moment simply stared. "You look beautiful," he said finally, the directness of the compliment making her blush. "Thank you. You look quite handsome yourself." The journey to town was filled with an anticipation that made ordinary conversation difficult. Grace found herself wondering if this outing constituted something more than a casual excursion between employer and employee. Xavier had specifically invited her, after all, rather than simply announcing his intentions to attend. Wasco had transformed for the celebration. American flags hung from every building, tables laden with food filled the area near the church, and a wooden platform had been constructed for dancing. Children ran about with sparklers while their parents socialized in groups. As they arrived, Grace was conscious of the curious glances directed their way. Clearly, Xavier's appearance at a social function was noteworthy enough, but his arrival with her caused a definite stir. "Mr. Weston, what a pleasant surprise." Mrs. Abernathy bustled over to greet them. "And Miss Porter, my goodness, don't you look lovely? We're so glad you could both join us." The afternoon passed pleasantly as they mingled with townspeople. Grace was introduced to so many people she could hardly keep track of names. But she noticed that while everyone was polite, Xavier was treated with a certain deference that spoke of respect rather than true familiarity. As evening approached, the fiddlers took their places on the platform and couples began to gather for dancing. Grace watched with enjoyment, tapping her foot to the lively tunes. "Would you care to dance?" Xavier asked, offering his hand. Grace hesitated only a moment before accepting. "I should warn you, it's been some time since I've done this." "That makes two of us," he admitted as he led her to the platform. Their first steps were awkward, but they quickly found a rhythm together. Xavier proved to be a competent dancer, guiding her through the figures with a sure hand at her waist. By the second dance, Grace was laughing with the sheer pleasure of it, her earlier self-consciousness forgotten. During a pause between songs, Maxwell appeared beside them, his eyes lingering on Grace in a way that made her skin crawl. "May I have the next dance, Miss Porter?" he asked with exaggerated politeness. Before Grace could formulate a polite refusal, Xavier's hand tightened slightly on hers. "I'm afraid Miss Porter has already promised the next dance to me," he said smoothly. Maxwell's eyes narrowed. "The entire evening, Weston, seems selfish, keeping such a lovely partner all to yourself." "The lady's choices are her own," Xavier replied evenly. "I simply have the good fortune to be chosen." With that, he guided Grace back into the dance as the music resumed, leaving Maxwell glowering on the sidelines. "Thank you," Grace said quietly, "though I could have handled him." "I know you could have," Xavier assured her. "But the man infuriates me, the way he looks at you." "And how is that different from how other men look at me?" she asked before she could reconsider her boldness. Xavier's steps faltered slightly. "I would hope it's very different," he said finally, his voice lower. "A man can admire beauty without objectifying it, can recognize value without calculating price." The intensity in his eyes made Grace's breath catch. For a moment, she thought he might say more, but the dance ended, and the spell was broken. Later, as darkness fell, they found a spot on a hillside to watch the fireworks. Sitting side by side on a blanket Xavier had brought from the wagon, they were close enough that Grace could feel the warmth of him even in the summer air. As the first brilliant bursts of color illuminated the sky, gasps and cheers rose from the crowd. Grace watched, entranced by the spectacular display. When she turned to share her delight with Xavier, she found him watching her rather than the sky, an unguarded tenderness in his expression that made her heart race. Slowly, giving her every chance to move away, he leaned closer. Grace held her breath as his lips met hers in a kiss so gentle it was almost reverent. The world narrowed to that single point of contact, the fireworks forgotten as something equally explosive ignited between them. When they broke apart, Xavier studied her face in the reflected light of the display overhead. "I've wanted to do that for a very long time," he admitted softly. "Why didn't you?" Grace asked, equally quiet. "Because I needed you to know that your position in my home wasn't conditional on this. On my feelings for you." His hand found hers on the blanket. "I didn't save you from one form of bondage just to impose another." Grace entwined her fingers with his. "I've never felt anything but free with you, Xavier, free to be myself, to build a new life." She smiled. "And free to choose who I give my heart to." "And have you chosen?" he asked, vulnerability evident in his question. In answer, Grace leaned forward to initiate a second kiss, this one less hesitant than the first. Against her lips, she felt Xavier's smile. The ride home that night had a dreamlike quality, the road silvered by moonlight, the air still warm but relieved by occasional breezes. They spoke little, but their hands remained joined across the wagon seat, both content to savor this new understanding between them. At the ranch, Xavier walked Grace to her door, kissing her once more before bidding her good night. She fell asleep with the memory of his lips on hers, wondering what the morning would bring. The following day brought a return to routine, but with subtle differences. Xavier's good morning carried a new warmth, his hand occasionally finding reasons to touch hers, his eyes seeking her out more frequently throughout the day. That evening they sat together on the porch as usual, but closer now, shoulders touching as they watched the sunset. "I want to court you properly, Grace," Xavier said, breaking a comfortable silence. "If that's what you want too." "I'd like that," she replied, her heart full. "Though I'm not sure what proper courting looks like when we already live under the same roof," he chuckled. "Fair point. Perhaps we adapt the conventions to our situation." After a pause, he added more seriously, "I want you to know that my intentions are honorable. I'm not looking for a temporary arrangement." Grace turned to face him fully. "Neither am I. What happened between us yesterday?" "It means something to me, Xavier. You mean something to me." He reached for her hand, bringing it to his lips in a gesture both old-fashioned and deeply touching. "You've come to mean everything to me, Grace Porter." The days that followed took on a golden quality as their relationship deepened. Xavier made time each day to be with Grace, sometimes helping with her tasks, other times simply talking. She learned more about his past, his difficult years after his parents' deaths, working in mines and on cattle drives before saving enough to buy his land. He listened intently to her stories of her childhood in Ohio, her parents' progressive ideas, her dreams for the future. In the evenings, they might read together by the fire, his arm around her shoulders, or walk under the stars, planning improvements to the ranch house or discussing books they'd both read. Physical affection between them remained modest, tender kisses, held hands, the comfort of embraces, both respecting the propriety of their unmarried status despite living under one roof. Word of their relationship inevitably reached town. Mrs. Abernathy made pointed inquiries when Grace accompanied Xavier on supply trips, while the ranch hands maintained a respectful silence punctuated by knowing glances. In late August, a letter arrived for Xavier that brought a shadow to his face. He read it twice before joining Grace on the porch that evening. "My sister Rebecca is ill," he explained, handing her the letter. "Her husband writes that the doctors are concerned." Grace read the carefully penned words with growing concern. "Consumption," she said quietly. "I'm so sorry, Xavier." "Will you go to her?" He nodded, his expression troubled. "I must. She's my only family." He took Grace's hand. "I hate to leave you, but I don't see an alternative." "Of course you must go," Grace assured him. "Family comes first, your family too," he said firmly. "Or at least, I hope you will be." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box. "I had planned to do this differently, somewhere special, with more romance than practicality, but life rarely waits for perfect moments." He opened the box to reveal a simple gold band set with a small sapphire. "Grace Porter, these past months have shown me what it means to truly share a life with someone. I love you, and I want to build a future with you. Will you marry me?" Grace's vision blurred with tears as she looked from the ring to Xavier's face, so earnest and vulnerable in this moment. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will marry you, Xavier Weston." His smile was brilliant as he slipped the ring onto her finger. "I'll speak to the pastor before I leave, make arrangements for when I return." "How long will you be gone?" Grace asked as he gathered her into his arms. "A month, perhaps longer. Boston is a long journey." He pressed his forehead to hers. "I'll come back to you as quickly as I can." "I'll be here," she promised, "managing your ranch, awaiting your return." Xavier left 2 days later, having made arrangements with the hands about ranch management and with the pastor about a wedding upon his return. Grace stood on the porch watching until he disappeared from view, the weight of the ring on her finger both comfort and promise. The days without Xavier stretched long, but Grace threw herself into her duties with renewed purpose. She began keeping a ledger of ranch expenses and production, as Xavier had shown her, met with the hands each morning to discuss the day's work, and even learned to ride better, allowing her to check on distant pastures. She wrote to Xavier often, sending letters to his sister's address in Boston, pouring out her thoughts and feelings along with news of the ranch. His replies, when they eventually arrived, were full of his concern for Rebecca, whose condition fluctuated, and his longing to return to Montana to her. "The doctors are more hopeful now," he wrote in early October. "Rebecca has shown improvement with the new treatments. If her progress continues, I may be able to leave within the week. I dream of you every night, Grace, of our life together, our future. Hold that dream for me until I return." Grace read and reread his letters until the paper grew soft at the folds. She prepared the house for winter, put up preserves from the garden's final harvest, and began work on a quilt for their marriage bed. Then came the telegram that changed everything. "Xavier gravely ill, stop fever worsening, stop doctor concerned, stop. Will write when condition changes, stop Robert Fleming." Grace stared at the telegram in horror, her mind racing. Xavier ill, perhaps with the same disease that had taken her parents, that threatened his sister. The same illness that had orphaned him once already. The cruelty of it seemed unbearable. Days passed with no further word. Grace continued her duties mechanically, moving through each task while her mind remained fixed on Boston, on Xavier fighting for his life a continent away. She prayed, something she hadn't done with real conviction since her parents' deaths, bargaining with God for Xavier's recovery. When the letter finally arrived, Grace's hands trembled so violently she could barely open it. The handwriting wasn't Xavier's, but his brother-in-law's formal, precise strokes that delivered their message with devastating clarity. Xavier had died. The fever had taken him 3 days after the telegram was sent. Grace read the words over and over, refusing to accept them. It wasn't possible. Not Xavier, so vital and strong. Not when they had plans, dreams, a future mapped out together. Not when she had finally found family in him as he had in her. The ranch hands found her still sitting at the table hours later, the letter clutched in her hand, her face wet with tears she didn't remember shedding. The days that followed passed in a fog of grief. Grace moved through them like a sleepwalker, performing essential tasks, but feeling disconnected from the world around her. The hands treated her with awkward sympathy, unsure of her position now that Xavier was gone. A week after the news arrived, another letter came, this one from a lawyer in Helena. Xavier had left a will, updated during his brief visit to town before departing for Boston. He had left everything, the ranch, the livestock, his savings, to Grace. She was now the owner of Horizon Ranch. The knowledge brought no joy, only a hollow ache where happiness should have been. What use was a ranch, a home, without him to share it? That night, sitting alone on the porch where they had shared so many conversations, Grace made a decision. She would honor Xavier by keeping his dream alive. She would run the ranch he had built, preserve what he had created through determination and hard work. It was what he would have wanted. The following morning, she gathered the ranch hands. "I know there are questions about what happens now," she began, her voice steadier than she felt. "I want you all to know that Horizon Ranch will continue operations as before. Mr. Weston left everything to me, and I intend to keep his legacy intact." The men exchanged glances, but Garrett, who had been there longest, stepped forward. "Miss Porter, we're mighty sorry about Mr. Weston. He was a good boss and a good man. He twisted his hat in his hands. "If you're staying on, we're with you. We'll help any way we can." Tears threatened, but Grace blinked them back. "Thank you. I know I have much to learn about ranching, but I'm willing to work hard." Xavier Mr. Weston believed in this place, and so do I. The winter of 1876–77 was harsh, testing Grace's resolve and the ranch's resources. Heavy snow isolated them for weeks at a time, and bitter cold claimed 2 calves despite their best efforts. But they endured, Grace working alongside the hands, learning what she needed to know to keep the operation running. At night, alone in the house that still held so many reminders of Xavier, she wrote in the journal he had given her her thoughts, her grief, her determination to honor him through her actions. Sometimes she imagined she could feel his presence, encouraging her when difficulties mounted, celebrating her small victories. Spring brought renewed hope with its green shoots and newborn calves. Grace found herself looking forward again, planning improvements to the ranch, considering which markets might prove most profitable for their cattle. On a mild April day, as Grace was working in the newly planted kitchen garden, Garrett rode in at a gallop, something unusual enough to bring her to her feet in alarm. "Rider coming," he announced, reining in his horse. "Thought you should know it's a fancy rig city folk by the look of it." Grace shaded her eyes, spotting the approaching buggy. "Thank you, Garrett. I'll handle this." She removed her gardening apron and smoothed her hair, wondering what business a fancy rig might have at Horizon Ranch. Perhaps it was the banker from Wasco, coming to discuss the loan she was considering for expanding their breeding stock. The buggy drew closer, driven by a man she didn't recognize. Beside him sat a woman wrapped in a traveling cloak, despite the mild weather. As they pulled up to the house, Grace approached with a polite greeting ready on her lips. The words died unspoken as the man helped his passenger down. She was thin, almost frail, with a pallor that spoke of recent illness, but her eyes so familiar they made Grace's heart stutter, fixed on her with recognition. "You must be Grace," the woman said, her voice soft but clear. "I'm Rebecca Fleming, Xavier's sister." Grace stared, momentarily speechless. "Mrs. Fleming, I don't understand. Why are you here?" Rebecca glanced at her companion. "Robert, would you mind giving us a moment?" When he had moved discreetly away, she turned back to Grace. "I believe there's been a terrible mistake. One I've only just discovered." She reached into her bag and withdrew an envelope. "This letter was misplaced during my illness. It was meant to be sent to you months ago." With trembling fingers, Grace accepted the envelope. Her name was written on it in a painfully familiar hand, Xavier's handwriting. She tore it open, unfolding the single sheet inside. "My dearest Grace," it began. "Rebecca continues to improve, and I find myself increasingly anxious to return to you. My own health has been affected by the journey and the city air. Nothing serious, just a persistent cough that the doctor assures me will pass with rest. I plan to leave Boston within the week, and with fair weather and connections, should be home to you before the month ends. Hold my heart safe until then, as I will forever hold yours. All my love, Xavier." Grace looked up, confusion warring with a wild, impossible hope. "I don't understand. The letter from your husband said Xavier had died." Rebecca's expression softened with sympathy. "Robert never sent such a letter. When I recovered enough to read Xavier's correspondence, I found your letters and realized something was terribly wrong. Xavier left Boston in early October as he planned. But then where?" Grace couldn't complete the question, her mind reeling. "I believe he started for Montana but never arrived," Rebecca said gently. "There were several train accidents that season and stagecoach robberies in the territories, without knowing his exact route." She left the sentence unfinished. Grace sank onto the porch steps, the letter clutched in her hand. Xavier hadn't died of fever in Boston. He had set out for home for her and vanished somewhere along the way. The knowledge was somehow both better and worse than what she had believed. "I'm so sorry," Rebecca said, sitting carefully beside her. "When I found your letters, read about your engagement, realized what you must have been told, I had to come, had to tell you the truth, whatever it might be." "Thank you," Grace managed, though the words seemed inadequate. "I've been managing the ranch. Xavier left everything to me." Rebecca nodded. "That sounds like my brother, always planning ahead, taking care of those he loved." She hesitated. "I brought Xavier's personal effects, things he left in Boston. I thought you might want them." The next few days passed in a strange limbo as Grace adjusted to this new reality. Rebecca stayed at the ranch, gaining strength in the clear Montana air while sharing stories of Xavier's childhood, filling in pieces of his life that Grace had never known. "He wrote about you constantly," Rebecca told her as they sorted through Xavier's belongings. "I've never seen him so alive on paper, so full of plans and hopes." Among his things, they found a small notebook filled with sketches, designs for expanding the ranch house, adding a proper schoolroom for future generations, as the notation read. The evidence of his dreams for their shared future brought fresh grief, but also a deeper appreciation of what they might have built together. On Rebecca's third evening at the ranch, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, a ritual Grace had maintained even in Xavier's absence, a distant rider appeared on the horizon. "One of your hands returning late?" Rebecca asked, squinting against the fading light. Grace shook her head, a strange tension filling her. "They're all accounted for. Might be a neighbor needing help." They watched as the rider drew steadily closer, the silhouette growing more distinct against the darkening sky. Something about the way the man sat his horse, the broad shoulders and straight back, triggered a recognition so powerful that Grace stood without realizing it. "It can't be," she whispered, her heart pounding so violently she felt light-headed, but it was. As the rider entered the yard, features becoming clear in the last light of day, Grace found herself looking at a ghost at Xavier Weston, thinner and more weathered than when he'd left, but unmistakably, impossibly alive. He dismounted slowly, as if uncertain of his welcome, his eyes never leaving Grace's face. "Grace," he said, her name a prayer on his lips. She couldn't move, couldn't speak, afraid that any action might shatter this miracle. It was Rebecca who broke the spell, rushing down the steps with a cry of disbelief. "Xavier, dear God, you're alive." He caught his sister in a careful embrace, but his gaze remained fixed on Grace. "I'm sorry," he said over Rebecca's shoulder. "So sorry for what you must have thought, what you must have gone through." Finally, Grace found her voice. "Where have you been? I thought you were dead." Xavier gently disengaged from his sister. "It's a long story, one I've been waiting months to tell you." He climbed the steps slowly, stopping before Grace. "If you'll still listen." In answer, she threw herself into his arms, holding him so tightly she could feel his heart beating against hers, solid, real, alive. His arms encircled her with equal desperation, his face buried in her hair. "I thought I'd lost you," Grace whispered against his chest. "I thought I'd never see you again." "Nothing could keep me from coming back to you," Xavier vowed. "Not distance, not illness, not even death itself." Inside, with Rebecca discreetly retiring early to give them privacy, Xavier explained his long absence. The train he'd been traveling on had derailed in Minnesota. He'd been thrown clear but badly injured, a broken leg, cracked ribs, and a head wound that had left him unconscious for days. "When I woke, I had no memory of who I was," he said, holding Grace's hand as if afraid she might disappear. The local doctor took me in, treated my injuries, called me John for lack of a name. For weeks, he had existed in this limbo. Flashes of memory tantalizingly brief: a ranch, mountains, a woman's smile. The doctor had found Xavier's ticket and knew he'd been heading west, but with no identification beyond a pocket watch engraved only with initials. His true identity remained a mystery. "It was your letters that brought me back," Xavier continued. "I kept seeing your face in my dreams, hearing your voice. Then one day, working in the doctor's garden, it all came flooding back: who I was, where I belonged, you." By then it was winter, his injuries still healing, travel difficult. He'd written immediately to both Boston and the ranch, but now realized neither letter had arrived. "As soon as I could ride, I started for home," he finished. "For you." Grace listened, tears flowing freely now. "I received a telegram, then a letter saying you had died of fever in Boston." Xavier frowned. "I never sent a telegram, and the only letter I wrote from Boston was the one saying I was preparing to leave." A suspicion formed in Grace's mind. "The letter about your death came from someone claiming to be Robert Fleming, but your sister says he never wrote to me." "Someone wanted you to believe I was dead," Xavier said slowly. "Someone who might benefit from my absence." Understanding dawned simultaneously. "Maxwell," they said together. The saloon owner had made no secret of his interest in Grace or his resentment of Xavier. He would have known from town gossip that Xavier had gone east, that Grace was alone at the ranch. "He must have intercepted my letters from Boston, sent the false news of my death," Xavier reasoned. "Hoping you would be vulnerable, perhaps forced to sell the ranch." "He didn't know you'd left everything to me," Grace said. "Didn't know I'd rather work myself to exhaustion than give up what you built." Xavier's expression softened with pride and love. "Rebecca told me what you've done here, how you've not just maintained the ranch but improved it. You're remarkable, Grace Porter." "I did it for you," she said simply, "to honor what would have been your wish." He cupped her face in his hands. "And now, what do you wish now that I've returned?" Grace covered his hands with hers. "The same thing I've wished for since last summer: to be your wife, to build a life with you." Xavier smiled, the joy in his eyes chasing away the shadows of their long separation. "Then let's not waste another day." They were married 2 weeks later in the Wasco church, with Rebecca standing as Grace's witness and Garrett as Xavier's. The entire town turned out for the celebration with one notable exception. Maxwell had abruptly sold his saloon and left the territory upon hearing of Xavier's miraculous return. After the ceremony, Xavier surprised Grace by taking her not back to the ranch, but to a spot along the creek where they had first begun to acknowledge their feelings for each other. There, under the cottonwoods now fully leafed in spring green, he presented her with a new journal. "For our story," he explained, "the one we'll write together." That evening, returning to Horizon Ranch as husband and wife, they stood together on the porch watching stars appear in the vast Montana sky. "I meant what I said that day at the auction," Xavier said, his arm around Grace's waist. "I'll be the family you deserve, devoted, faithful, present for all the days we're granted together." "And I'll be yours," Grace promised, leaning into his embrace. "The family you've sought, the home you've built, the love you've earned." In the years that followed, Horizon Ranch prospered under their joint stewardship. Grace eventually opened a small school for the children of neighboring ranches, fulfilling her dream of teaching, while Xavier expanded their horse breeding operation into one of the most respected in the territory. Their family grew with the birth of a son the following spring, named James after Grace's father, and later a daughter they called Elizabeth, for Xavier's mother. Rebecca visited often from Boston, eventually relocating permanently when her husband passed away. On warm summer evenings, the family could be found on the porch of the expanded ranch house, Xavier and Grace sitting close together, watching their children play while the sun set over land that had witnessed their separation and reunion, their hardships and triumphs. Their enduring love story built on second chances and unbreakable bonds. And in a drawer in their bedroom, Grace kept two treasures. The journal Xavier had first given her, filled with her thoughts during their time apart, and the newer one they wrote in together, the ongoing chronicle of the family they had become to each other, against all odds in the vastness of the Montana wilderness.